I want to set it up a little bit with, just right off the top, I think the 2000s were just a remarkable decade for movies. I went through my spreadsheet. There were over 50 movies from the 2000s I genuinely 5-star loved on the patented Filmspotting rating system that, of course, we did steal from Netflix. I remember some specific moments. Those specific moments, I think, moments that are specific to going to the movies by yourself. I remember in 2000 walking out of the Chicago's Music Box Theater after Edward Yang's Yee Yee, feeling like I was seeing a world with new eyes. Memento, of course. And, of course, here I'm mentioning a few films that aren't going to make my top 5, but were incredible experiences, movie-going experiences in the 2000s. Feeling like I'd witnessed some kind of apocalypse at the end of City of God. Stumbling onto Clark Avenue after Mulholland Drive and feeling like every face I saw was transformed into a carnival-like creepiness. Blissed out on Michel Gondry's Science of Sleep, feeling like I was riding a papier-mâché horse out of the theater lobby. Just incredible experiences that you can only have when nobody's there to break the spell. And I guess when I was trying to determine with those 50 movies that I loved how to come up with a criteria for the films that were going to make my top 5, I was struggling with, is this a best of 2000s list or is this a favorites of my 2000s list? Should there be a difference? And knowing what the critical consensus was on so many of these films. But essentially I managed to come up with some criteria which were for those films that I think ultimately there were 5 that I loved more than any other. And the criteria I sort of came up with was that each of them contained everything I want from a movie. Surprise, original and creative, even audacious storytelling that captures the full spectrum of human experience. From tragedy to comedy, I want to laugh, I want to cry, and if I'm paying for the pleasure of being manipulated, I don't want to feel cheap at the end of the night. So basically, I want it all. The top 5 movies of the decade give everything to me.
I can't wait to hear then. What is your number 5? The suspense is killing me.
Number 5 is adaptation, because only Spike Jonze should be allowed to make Charlie Kaufman movies unless they're directed by Michel Gondry. And I think partially because I learned to love the movie, a part of the movie that a lot of people ended up hating or resenting, and that's sort of the last third of the movie when it undergoes that dramatic tonal shift. And I guess I was really upset about that turn the movie takes when I first saw it, and it's the only movie I can think of in the decade that kept me up at night trying to figure out what the filmmaker's intentions were. And I went back and saw it a couple days later and was actually really moved by what happens in the last third of that movie, and it feels like a real release on Kaufman's kind of paralyzing anxiety, and I found it kind of exhilarating. So number 5, adaptation.
Of course, we heard that one from Steve Procopi earlier in the show. His number 1 pick of the decade was adaptation. A great pick there. Sam, why don't we go to your number 5, Matty?
It is Miyazaki's crowning animated achievement, Spirited Away. I don't know if you've ever had those dreams where the world that you're dreaming is so fully realized that it offers up its own logic, and then that logic seems impenetrably sound. The squirrel tells you to give the Pop-Tart to Ringo Starr dressed as the Wake Forest Demon Deacon, and it just seems right in that dream. And then while you're sleeping, you think, God, man, that would make a great screenplay. And unfortunately, when you wake up, you've forgotten it all. That's how Spirited Away plays to me. On the surface, it might, play like something you would conjure up during your stay at the medical tent at Coachella. But I think it's a completely realized dream world with this self-sustaining, almost magical logic. You don't know where it's going, but somehow it all makes sense. I think there's probably a Talking Heads song in there somewhere.
Another tough one for me to leave out, Spirited Away, a great pick. And going with my pick so far, and saying we did talk about this a little bit before we sat down here, is I did want to stick with movies for my top 10 and certainly my top 5 that do represent bravura filmmaking. These are great films directed by filmmakers, I really think probably at the height of their powers as directors. They need to be great achievements with engrossing stories and characters. I think you touched on that as well. I don't necessarily need the humor, even though that can be a great element to obviously throw in there. But some of these movies are pretty dark, and actually you mentioned one of them. My number 5 is a film that I remember having a similar reaction when I walked out of the theater when I saw it back in Iowa City, Iowa, and feeling like the whole world was going to start moving backwards, just like the movie itself. It is the movie Memento, where you have two narrative worlds, the black and white and the color, and two parts to this character played by Guy Pearce, one focused on revenge and driven by his love for his wife. And then by the time you get to the end of the movie, where it really all comes together so perfectly, you realize that it's much more sinister and cynical than that, actually. And again, I think it does all make sense in the end, not because, the story, which has had this bizarre technique of being backward, it's not that it's finally resolved in some way, but we actually do get to understand the true motivation of the main character. And we do understand, I guess, as well, why it was told the way it was. But the troubling part of that is, despite how dark it is and how troubling it is, that motivation, we can understand it. I think we can almost empathize with it by the end. We can understand why the character is motivated the way he is. So I love Memento, and it also gets back to my theme for my top 10 of kind of these fractured identities. But there's also this sense with my top 5, the way I think you really sum up the decade is this idea of the only order to the world is chaos. The rules, if there ever were any, no longer apply. And whether or not you want to get into the whole 9/11 analogy or not, I think there is a sense in the best films of the decade, the ones I think that really does kind of define the decade, the movies that really do explore those themes of all of a sudden, it's chaos reigns. With no offense to Lars von Trier, chaos reigns.
It's got to be tough for you then that Fight Club came out in the 90s.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A good pick. Sam, what about your number 4?
Number 4, 24-Hour Party People.
Great pick.
Michael Winterbottom.
Great pick.
Michael Winterbottom is the British Steven Soderbergh, and we need more directors like Winterbottom and Steven Soderbergh.
Had to get in a reference, didn't you?
I had to mention him. He's smart, he's curious, he's creative, and he likes to work all the time. Those are my kind of guys. And Soderbergh had a hell of a decade, and as many know, he can do no wrong in my eyes, but as far as I'm concerned, Winterbottom's best this decade is better than Soderbergh's best, so I'll take 24-Hour Party People over, you name it, Traffic, Ocean's 11, The Informant. Yes, it's even better than Bubble. You heard it here.
Wow, I don't believe you're actually going there, Sam, rejecting Bubble in favor of Michael Winterbottom, but it is
the girlfriend experience, all of it. Yeah, forget about it. No.
Wow.
24-Hour Party, I mean, for anybody that's seen it, the primary reason to see this is, especially, I guess, like me, I'd never seen Steve Coogan before.
Me neither.
So here's this just titanic comic performance. He's this incredible, untrustworthy guide through this comic tragic tale of the Manchester music scene from the late 70s punk scene through the drug-fueled rave scene in the early 90s. And I may have been familiar with Joy Division, the Happy Mondays, New Order, and other people that came out of that scene, but it brought me into that whole world and made me appreciate the music like I hadn't before. And it's a ride. And it's
so gonzo.
Brilliant filmmaking.
It's so meta. I'm so glad you put it on your list because it was my number 21. And I had to put Bela Tarr on there at number 20.
Just to be a film critic.
Just to be a film critic.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't have to deal with the consequences of my pick, so
exactly,
you do, Matty, so I
Sam,
understand where you're going.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, my number 4, Sam, I'm curious if you've seen this film. Talk to Her.
Pedro Almodovar.
I have to thank to thank Filmspotting for this film because it was first introduced to me during our Almodovar marathon.
Yep.
Like Tarantino, Almodovar's films, they're filled with these glorious homages to film itself and are particularly the women in those films. I think Almodovar celebrates women better than anybody, but it's not just an ode to melodrama. He handles his characters at the center of Talk to Her, particularly the two men who both find themselves at the bedside of these comatose women, with such decency and such respect, even if the characters themselves shouldn't be commanding either one from us. And at this point, I'm just trying to run out with my top 5, films that I've talked about ad nauseum. I'm trying to come up with new adverbs and adjectives to describe them. I really can't. I
remember how impressed you were with that film. I was as well, but you really thought, okay, this is one of my favorite films ever.
Yeah.
And it is a fantastic movie, one I definitely considered for the top 20. My number 4, it's one I really can't say it any better than you did earlier in the show. I definitely can't say it any better than Michael Phillips did when he left us this voicemail.
This is Michael Phillips at the Chicago Tribune, and for 3 more months, co-host at the movies. The best film of the decade. Well, it's obviously. Did you hear about the Morgans? Luckily, we just got that in under the wire because it was released in late 2009. But no, it's There Will Be Blood, for heaven's sake. I don't care if the film's not perfect. It's even a bit of a mess in many ways, and I still don't know what to make of that crazy epilogue. Although now that I know it's coming, I seem to be able to swing with that tonal change up better. But it's to me, I want my film of the decade to have some size and ambition and unresolved, really stimulating paradoxes in it. And I think if there's any film that sort of gets an American strain of ambition and desire and greed and all kinds of things, that's it. I don't want to hear from anybody who thinks they're No Country for Old Men or something that's formally almost flawless but sort of empty at its core. I don't want to hear anybody talking about that one as the best film of the decade. Nobody. I refuse to listen to that. I will not. I will hang up before someone finishes that thought. In fact, all right, guys, that's it. There Will Be Blood. That's my pick.
I really can't top that. Yes, There Will Be Blood is one of the best films of the decade, and it should have, one of these films that we're championing here on the show should have some heft and ambition to it, even if it's a little bit flawed. And maybe it should have a towering performance at its core. I think it really is a masterpiece. It's Paul Thomas Anderson evolving as a filmmaker, not just paying tribute to Scorsese or Altman like he did with some of his other films, being this kind of cinematic savant. It's truly a unique vision that he puts up there on the screen. And, of course, it does erupt into that chaos that we get there at the end of the film. So There Will Be Blood. Whether it is one that all works by the time you get to the end, I love how Michael Phillips said it, because I had the same reaction where the second time I saw it, when you know it's coming, when you know that Daniel Day-Lewis is about to go over that line, somehow it all makes sense. The first time catches you a little bit off guard, but I think upon further viewings it really does work. So There Will Be Blood, my number 4. Sam, your number 3.
Yeah, I feel like the 2000s were not a decade that produced many epics. Successful epics. It's hard to name any of them. Certainly none of them made my list. And when I look at my list, I wonder, was this a decade where we went small, where filmmakers went small? And it's easier to criticize big movies, too. They're usually dealing with big performances and big ideas, and they're hard to make. So I applaud that pick, Adam. My number 3 is another small movie by a movie written by my number 5 pick. I'm going with Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And I think there are a lot of reasons. I certainly love Charlie Kaufman as a writer, but I think what I like best about him and his collaborators is his theatricality. I think he creates worlds that require tremendous suspension of disbelief, and I love submitting to it, and I think he earns it. And it's only his real great genius, and again, the genius of his collaborators, specifically Jones and Gondry, of course, that allow him to pull it off. And I love this movie for the same reasons I think all people that love this movie love it. It's simultaneously heartbreaking and hopeful. It's equal parts whimsy and tragedy, and I think it's genuinely wise that relationships can and certainly will destroy you, and unfortunately, they're the only thing that can fix you as well. So, number 3, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Well, if my number 3 film is not the best, it'll do till the best gets here.
What calibers you got there, Sheriff?
9mm. Couple 45 ACPs. Somebody unloaded on that thing with a shotgun.
How come you reckon the coyote ain't been at him?
I don't know. Supposedly a coyote won't eat a Mexican.
These boys appear to be managerial. I think we're looking at more than one fracas. Execution here, Wild West over there.
That Mexican brown dope.
Oh, these boys is all swole up. So this was earlier, getting set to trade. Then, whoa, differences. You know, might not even have been no money.
That's possible.
But you don't believe it.
No. Probably I don't.
Well, it's a mess, ain't it, Sheriff?
If it ain't, it'll do till the mess gets here.
My apologies to Mr. Phillips. That's the Coen brothers' No Country for Old Men.
Yeah, well, we're going to hear more about that in a minute, and we're going to hear more about, Sam, your number 3 pick, because it's mine as well, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I was fortunate to have a chance to rewatch this movie just a few days ago to get ready for this countdown, and I hadn't seen it since it came out on DVD, and it really was like watching the film, discovering it all over again.
I did too. I did the same thing.
Yeah, the concept is so ridiculously brilliant, obviously, first of all, where you have Jim Carrey's Joel trying to save his memories, trying to stow away these memories, realizing as he's having these memories washed away that they really are what he wants to cling to, and they really are kind of what define us as human beings. And what I love, too, is you have a movie that isn't cliched in any way, shape, or form. It's totally a new, interesting way to tell the story. But at its core, it's a cliche. It's all about realizing that to have loved and lost is actually better than to never have loved at all. And I thought that was really kind of fascinating that they managed to tell that story and espouse that theme in such an interesting, provocative way. And there are so many payoffs I forgot about in terms of structure, the bookends, the way the movie's framed. The decisions that the main characters make at the end of the film is so wonderful, and I think so right on about human nature. And then you have all those great sequences with Joel escaping into his childhood. And, of course, Kate Winslet, we know she's always good. But Jim Carrey was a revelation again for me with this film. It's much more than just a case of him not being Ace Ventura, being a quote-unquote serious actor. Sam, I referenced a line from you earlier talking about Campbell Scott and his emotional intelligence. Well, it all applies to Jim Carrey here. He is so in tune with Joel's loneliness and his shortcomings that his verbal and his nonverbal reactions, they're so understated. They say everything about the character, and all those little interactions between he and Kate Winslet, I think, are so perfect in this film.
Who am I?
Mrs. Hamlin.
Right, Mrs. Hamlin.
I must be about 4. Oh, my gosh.
Got the salad bowl, so I'm serving salad and string beans. Is he handed in? Peanut, are you all right? God, honestly, I feel like I could clean up all day. Listen, would you hate me if I asked you to clean some string beans?
No, not at all. God, I love this kitchen.
Thank you so much.
She's not looking at me. She's busy. She's not looking at me. No one ever looks at me. I want my mommy.
Oh, baby Joel.
And I think that credit goes to Gondry, too.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
who's shown, obviously, his ability to guide actors with Gael Garcia Bernal and something like Signs of Sleep, guiding them through this weird dreamscape of a film.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Carrey's great, too. I was surprised to go back and find out how good he was. I think it was one of the reasons I didn't go back to it sooner. I was afraid that Carrey kind of maybe didn't live up to the movie's quality, but he really is so strong in it. But it's funny, it's the one movie, Matty, you can maybe chime in here. Eternal Sunshine is the one movie on my list, on my top 5, that doesn't have a kind of pantheon performance of the decade. I think that was really important to me, or at least made great films even greater, was great films. And as Mr. Actor, Matty, I don't know how important that was to you too. But my number 2 does feature one of those great pantheon performances, at least for me. P.T. Anderson's Punch Drunk Love is my number 2. And I think I love it because Anderson seemed to pull 3 random things out of a hat and decided to make a movie. Plunger, harmonium, and mattress, let's make a movie. And then someone dared him to cast Adam Sandler as the lead, and I genuinely think that Sandler gives one of the best performances of the decade, even if it means P.T. Anderson kind of tweaking the Adam Sandler that we all know. I think he does it brilliantly, and it's my favorite love story of the decade, and it's a beautiful, open-hearted, uncynical love story about 2 complete weirdos, and it's probably my favorite love story along with Harold and Maude. I just adore the film.
It's my number 22, Sam. And
22.
All right, we're going backwards. We'll get to your number 30 by number 1.
I knew it was going to make your list, and I think it's a terrific bookend. You brought up all these different things, the mattress, all these things that could have led to Quirk, but it never descended into that. We just watched a film 2 years ago, or was it just last year, called Gigantic. It tried to use the same ingredients, and it failed miserably. This works because of the heart, because of those performances.
And also the mastery, I think, in the direction that we get there from Paul Thomas Anderson. It really is another masterpiece for him, probably. And all I can throw in at this point is, this is serious. In my notes, if you look at them, it says these words, "Oh God, Punch Drunk Love, ? Because about 10 minutes before we started recording, I realized that it was made in this decade. I had completely forgotten it, and now that it's in my mind, I'm like, great, now where do I fit that in this top 20 that I already slaved so hard to find room for these movies? Now I got to think about Punch Drunk Love. So it's on the outside looking in for me. I'm glad it found a spot on your list.
I love Science of Sleep. I love Punch Drunk Love, but its praises have already been sung here. It is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless
Your number
Mind
2
is my number 2. And I think it's because Gondry can seemingly find a way to film the intangible. I don't know how he does that, but he puts you on that train after the concert at 2 a.m. on that train home from the weekend full of lazy naps. Her head is nestled right there in your neck, and you can feel her breathe. And you don't want that moment to end. So what you do is you bottle it in your mind. You memorize the details. You trace her hand. You memorize the smell of her hair. Hell, you remember the smell of the punk of the kid sitting 2 rows down wearing the Of Montreal t-shirt. You want to live there. You want to live in that suspended moment. Sam, you and I kind of came of age in this decade. I know you were in that moment. Gondry shows you can't live there. You have to move on. That train just can't keep on going into the night. And in fact, it's dangerous to want to try to live there. And then, of course, Gondry and company, they go on to show you why.
Well, I don't know really how to follow that up, Sam. Do you?
No, I don't. But what I would say is, like, try watching Eternal Sunshine and Science of Sleep back to back. You may never leave. You may not return from that place. I really think Matty's completely right. Is what Gondry is so gifted at is really showing us how he sees the world, which I think is remarkable, because I don't know how you could see the world that way and actually make it. Because it just seems like you especially filmmaking, which is so technical.
Yeah.
How are you able to pull it off?
How are those films tactile? How are they? I mean, they affect your olfactory senses. I mean,
they really
bizarre.
do. And like I said, I mean, walking out of Science of Sleep, I've never felt that way. It was like the David Lynch experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, instead of making everything seem sinister, he makes everything seem, you know, like not quite real. Like you're not living in a world that has boundaries in some way. It really is. It's an incredible gift.
Well, we're obviously all big fans of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind here on Filmspotting. Adam Kempenaar, Matty Robinson, and Sam Van Hallgren. We're sharing our top 5 films of the decade, and I'd say that I'd bring us back crashing down to earth, but actually I don't know that the Coen brothers do that with No Country for Old Men, which is my number 2, and I'm not going to wax on about the technical brilliance of the film. I think we've talked about it a fair amount on the show. I also don't really think it's up for debate. But to go back to the voicemail we heard from our friend Michael Phillips earlier, where he said, no way is he putting No Country for Old Men on. He's not going to put on a technically brilliant but empty film as his number 1 pick. This is my question for you guys. Do you think anybody would actually pay to see Michael Phillips and I in a Lincoln Douglas-style debate about the profoundness of No Country for Old Men? Can we make a buck off that? Because I'm ready to throw down anytime. And we got into it a little bit when Phillips was on our Best of the Year show a couple of years ago. But to write No Country for Old Men off as merely a great formal achievement, but otherwise empty, I really think is to somehow extricate it from the entire body of work the Coen brothers have given us. They've been exploring these existential themes raised by No Country for Old Men since at least as far back as The Man Who Wasn't There, and I think this film does it just as thoroughly. I would argue, as a Coen brothers film we both loved, and I know that Michael Phillips loved as well from last year, A Serious Man. There's a reason why Javier Bardem's Anton Chigurh flips a coin to decide people's fates. And it isn't just because the Coen brothers think it's hilarious. You might as well flip a coin because there's no justice, there's no fairness, there's just the struggle. And the more you try to impose that order, as I touched on earlier, the more likely to get hurt you are. This is truly chaos reigning in No Country for Old Men. Again, I think it fits perfectly in with the Coen brothers' larger body of work. And I really find it curious to just write it off as a great, kind of suspense, thriller, chase movie, even though it works on that level too. I think there's so much more going on, though.
I have to say that I more or less side with Michael Phillips. I can recognize the genius of the Coen brothers, especially in No Country for Old Men and something like A Serious Man, too. Rewards multiple viewings. Brilliant stuff that deals with really deep and profound philosophical issues. I don't love these films. I admire them, and maybe that's what Michael Phillips is referring to. I wouldn't think of it as writing it off, and I don't think it's without heart.
He kind of writes it off. Maybe you don't. Michael Phillips
maybe
does.
I don't, but I find them hard to like, hard to love. I like, admire, any number of adjectives, but not love, like I do my number 1 film. And are you ready, folks, for some Vanperbole? Are you ready for the hammer to drop?
It's not American Dreams, is it? Or Superman Returns?
No, I'm not trying to make people angry. Number 1 is There Will Be Blood. Yes, my 1 and 2 films of the decade were both directed and written by P.T. Anderson. P.T. Anderson is untouchable right now. He's got Coppola's mad ambition. He's got Scorsese's technical brilliance and genius for scoring. He's got Altman's gift for patience and ensemble. He's got Malick's obsession with detail. He's a brilliant writer on top of all that. He's a 21st century Preston Sturges. If Preston Sturges was also John Ford, with There Will Be Blood, he made a big movie about big ideas that hasn't been matched by anything since Apocalypse Now. It is the singular masterpiece of the decade, and it can be fairly compared with the masterpieces of any preceding decade. And let's not forget that the movie features the best performance by an actor in more than 30 years. It's one for the ages. I drink your milkshake, gentlemen.
You're out of control, but I can't argue with you.
Louder, Daniel! I am a sinner!
I am a sinner.
I am sorry, Lord.
I am sorry, Lord.
I want the blood.
I want the blood.
You have abandoned your child.
I've abandoned my child.
I will never backslide.
I will never backslide.
I was lost, but now I am found.
I was lost, but now I'm found.
I have abandoned my child. Say it.
I abandoned my child.
Say it louder. Say it louder.
I've abandoned my child. I've abandoned my child. I've abandoned my boy.
Wait, Mickey Rourke was not in There Will Be. Was that a DVD extra? Wait, did Jimmy Cagney show up in There Will Be Blood?
That was more than 30 years ago, Matty, in fairness.
You didn't see the wrestling match between...
Wow,
Yeah.
very passionately argued and articulated. Obviously, we love the film as well. It made both of our lists here, at least in the top 20, top 5 for me. So,
Well, let's move from some hyperbole to some Matty Ballgame rant.
oh no.
Yeah.
A speech is coming on?
It's coming. It's
okay.
coming.
I'm going to go out and get a drink. Is that okay?
Don't worry, I've had several. My number one film of the decade, actually a very, very personal choice for me because I think it reflects the struggle and the frustration that I've actually gone through over the past 10 years. I mean, we spent the better part of 10 years dealing with the fallout of one single event that took place in September of 2001. And ironically enough, Gus Van Sant's Elephant has nothing to do with 9/11, but it's inspired by another horrific event in the 90s, the Columbine shooting.
Hey, Paul. Yeah, it's John. Yeah, Dad's John again. No,
So, Mr. McFarland.
Hi, Mr. Lewis. I'm sorry I'm late. My dad took me out to lunch. I mean,
Meet me in my office.
Yeah, I'm in trouble now. Yeah, will you pick him up? I'll leave the keys in the office. Can you do it, like, soon? Because I don't know if he's going to stay.
In the wake of a tragedy, what we do as a society in order to cope, along the lines of what you were talking about earlier, Adam, we try to craft our own narratives as quickly as possible. We try to ascribe our own mythology, our own heroes and our own villains. We want black and white. We don't want to live in the gray. And we're grasping for any sensational nugget that's going to facilitate that. These two kids are the bad guys. And they're the bad guys not only because they're bad, they're the losers. They've got terrible parents. They're part of the Trenchcoat Mafia. They listened to Marilyn Manson. He told them to do it. It turns out none of that was true. But by the time an actually more accurate accounting of what actually might have occurred comes out, the cameras, the 24-hour news cycle, all that's moved on. And we as a society have moved on. And we've already written in stone what happened. That was more than 10 years ago. And I think now it's more dangerous than ever. We live in an age of pervasive information. We're seemingly connected to every single square inch on this planet. Something happens somewhere and bam, within 2 minutes, we've got thousands of sources telling us what happened. And in 10 minutes, we've already created our own narrative. We've already compartmentalized the winners and the losers and made every judgment we could have made about what happened. And then, if we want further validation of what we think, we're just going to seek out those sources that will tell us what we want to hear. I'm going to listen to Glenn Beck because he's going to tell me what I want to hear. He's just going to validate my worldview. I'm going to listen to MSNBC. I'm going to read Daily Cause because they're going to tell me what I want to hear. That's turning your mind into a series of Wikipedia of truths. And so when I watch something like Elephant, and oddly enough, in sort of that glow that Gus Van Sant so starkly and poetically presents, the notion of truth through art has never, ever rung so true. And I'm reminded of why I love film. Here's the answer to maybe what Sam was posing earlier. Because it is my oasis. And it's not because it's mindless escapism. I think it's the exact opposite. Because a great film is going to make me ask the questions that reality seems far too intent on shielding me from through the opiate of convenience. That's the news from Lake Wobegon. I'm click and clack.
Wow. I really
night,
don't
good
know
luck.
where to go from there. I think we really should just cue up the theme music. I think the show is over at this point. Obviously, Elephant is a great movie, and there are other Gus Van Sant films I'm sure a lot of people considered for these kind of end-of-decade lists. Jerry maybe being in the mix as well, part of that death trilogy that Van Sant gives us. But it's a film I love, and I certainly can't take issue with anything you threw out there, Matty. Let's just get to my number one. I'm going to make this a lot less serious than it's gotten here on Film Spotting in the last 3 minutes. I got to go with Everyone Knows It's Coming. It is the David Lynch film Mulholland Drive. Truly the answer to that desert island question. You have to bring 3 movies with you. You're going to watch these 3 movies for the end of time. What do you bring? Well, I'm going to bring something like The Godfather or The Godfather 2 because I want long movies that are really rich and really nuanced in terms of their details so I can really get in and explore them for the end of time as I have nothing but time. And I'm also going to throw in a movie like Mulholland Drive because I want something that is a little bit impenetrable or just impenetrable enough to make it fascinating and yet still have something to grab onto. And I know a lot of people watch this movie for the first time and think there isn't anything to grab onto. I say watch it again and watch it again, and maybe by that third time, it really will start to make some sense, as it did for me finally. The stories at the core of Mulholland Drive are as old as time. Jilted, heartbroken lovers, burgeoning love, and the Hollywood dream. Only in this case, it's Lynch giving us the Hollywood nightmare, and he brings it to visceral life. And again, we get back to my main theme of these split personalities and chaos and the rules not applying. What rules apply in Mulholland Drive? I certainly can't think of any, so it's my number one, Sam, Mulholland Drive.
Mulholland Drive. And just to respond to Matty, because I feel like it's worth responding to and acknowledging, I'm so glad you had it on your list and at your number one, Matty. It was just as Adam and I sort of had this conversation about like all we went through to kind of come up with a 5. And at one point, before I came up with my 5, Gus Van Sant's the three of his films that he made this decade were kind of tied in my top 5, just because I think he accomplishes something so few directors bother to do anymore, and he's asking questions. Just like you said, he's a little overwhelmed by what's going on, but he thinks it's worth engaging in,
right.
And he engages with society, with society's problems. He doesn't have the answers. He's not trying to tell us how to think or how to feel. He wants us to ask the questions. He does it through film. He does it brilliantly. I love the pick of Elephant.
Yeah, certainly he makes challenging films. You're right. He is not going to give you any answers, and there are no answers at the core of Elephant. But by the time we get to the moment that we all know is coming, it really was. I remember the experience of seeing that movie for the first time, and I just saw it on DVD, but it's something very striking, and I'll never forget. So I love the pick. All around, Elephant, There Will Be Blood, and Mulholland Drive are number one films of the decade. I am glad we finally decided to get around to this here now about 5 months after the decade ended, but we wanted to do something big for our 300th show, and hopefully this qualified. Of course, it was also big and fun to have you on, Sam, and I know you